stream of intensive care at home today and intensive care hotline. But today we do want to focus on intensive care at home. Today's question is that today's topic that I want to focus on is, can you go home with intensive care at home without 24 hours intensive care nurses? That is the topic today. And I want to welcome you to this live stream. And I also want to welcome you if you're watching this later. So welcome. My name is Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home and Intensive Care Hotline. And again, I want to welcome you to this live stream. Now, before we dive into today's topic, just some housekeeping issues. I do these live streams regularly. At the moment, I'm trying to do them once a week. It's usually on a Saturday night around 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US, which is 4 p.m. on a Saturday, California time or Pacific Standard Time, and it's 11 a.m. here in Sydney, Melbourne, Australia. Unfortunately, it's in the middle of the night for our UK viewers, but you can watch the stream later. Now, if you have questions, please type them in the chat pad. Please keep them to today's topic. But if you have any other questions, I will absolutely get to them at the end of this topic. The live streams usually go for 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how many questions you've got and how quickly we can get through today's topic. Now, before I go into today's topic, you might be wondering what makes me qualified talking about today's topic, whether you can go home with intensive care at home without 24-hour intensive care nurses or ICU nurses. I'm an intensive care nurse by background. I have worked in intensive care for over 20 years in 3 different countries. I have also worked as a nurse unit manager in intensive care for over 5 years. I have set up the intensive care at home nursing service, and I have worked with intensive care at home even when I was working in intensive care prior, but now this is obviously a service that I own and operate, and I'm also running intensive care hotline where we help consult and advocate for families in intensive care all around the world. Now, let's dive into today's topic. Can you go home with intensive care at home without 24-hour intensive care nurses? This is a question we get all the time, because I know that families in intensive care are, for lack of a better term, desperate to go home when they have a loved one in intensive care long term. The short answer is no, you can't go home with intensive care at home without 24-hour intensive care nurses. Now, let me elaborate on this so you can understand why, and also what's the solution if you are in a situation like that. Because there are solutions, but they're probably not the quick fixes that everyone is looking for. I get it, especially still with COVID lingering in ICUs. You want to leave ICU as quickly as possible. There are visitation limitations. I know you want to leave ICU as quickly as possible. I get it. But at the same time, if you are going home without 24/7 intensive care nurses, it could be very detrimental. Quite frankly, it could be deadly. So let's break this down. I have to get on with the big gun here straight away to really illustrate why I'm saying you can't go home without 24-hour intensive care nurses. So we have looked after clients at home that needed 24-hour intensive care nursing at home in order to keep them out of ICU. And quite frankly, we were funded for, hi Modema, nice to see you again. We were funded for night shifts only, and we did night shifts for those clients that absolutely needed 24-hour intensive care nursing at home in order to keep them and get them out of ICU. We went back to the funding bodies at the time and to the families who were desperate to keep their loved ones at home, of course, and the clients wanted to be at home. We went back to the funding body, and we went also back to the families, and we said, look, when we are not there, i.e. during the daytime, your loved one or, a funding body's client is at risk of dying if there's no nurse there 24 hours a day. And unfortunately, our prediction there became a reality. Both clients passed away because during the daytime, medical emergencies could not be managed by either families or, you could call them support workers or carers or whatever you want to call them. Hi Leonie, how are you? And quite frankly, it was futile and it was very tragic. Both of them were children, and I've just seen too much in this space to know what needs to happen. And unfortunately, intensive care at home is what intensive care at home is. That the word, it's very descriptive. It's very descriptive, and unfortunately, people cannot go home without 24-hour intensive care nurses. Now, there might be some exceptions to that rule. The exception to the rule is if someone doesn't have a tracheostomy, if someone doesn't have an unstable airway. So the exception might be if someone is on BiPAP or CPAP, but even then, the nurse and ICU nurse needs to be there when the patient or the client is on BiPAP or CPAP at home, because again, that's mechanical ventilation. And obviously people have a need for that mechanical ventilation, and that needs to be managed by an intensive care nurse. So to illustrate this further, if a client or patient is in a hospital and ends up with a tracheostomy, ends up with ventilation, ends up with BiPAP ventilation, most of the time that cannot be managed on the ward or on a hospital floor. Again, it needs intensive care nursing skills. Again, there are some wards in a hospital that can manage BiPAP, that can manage CPAP, that can manage a tracheostomy, but even then the nurse to patient ratio is usually lower. If on a ward one nurse looks after 8 patients and they have a patient on CPAP or on BiPAP or with a tracheostomy, that nurse might only look after 4 patients, to accommodate the need for that higher risk. But in a home care setting, you can't have a nurse looking after 5 patients. That's just not possible, And what is the goal for intensive home care? The goal is to keep your loved one home predictably. That is the goal. The worst thing I believe that can happen is that you set up home care and then your loved one bounces back in and out of hospital or in and out of ICU. That's probably very, very disturbing. It's very taxing, and it could also be very discouraging, And again, I do fully understand everyone watching that your loved one, you need to get out of ICU, you want to get out of ICU. I get it. It's a terrible place, especially if you're in there long term. I understand that. But home care needs to be set up properly, and unfortunately, whilst we have a solution, we don't have a quick fix. Unfortunately, we don't have a quick fix. It needs to be thought through properly. Also, keep in mind, when you have a team coming into your home, which can be very intrusive, whilst I believe, we're providing a great service, please bear in mind, having quote unquote strangers in your home is very intrusive. And, you want to have the right team, and no amount of training for you as a family or for lay people, let's just call them lay people, will help you manage medical emergencies. And they do come up when someone is on a ventilator, has a tracheostomy. Those medical emergencies inevitably come up, and then you need to know what you're doing. And just to illustrate that further, even for us as a specialist service, it is still a reasonably high risk that we're taking. We believe we can manage that risk, but taking ICU patients home is full of risk, and it needs to be thought through properly. You need to have the right equipment. You need to have backup equipment. You need to have a backup plan what to do if things go wrong. You need to have a backup plan. What if the ventilator stops at 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning? It's very important that you think those scenarios through, and that you have a backup plan for almost every situation. Now, I know some of you might ask straight away, what about the cost? Yes, and I agree with you. If you could go home from intensive care with family support, that would certainly lower the cost. But if I was you, I wouldn't worry about the cost too much. When we first started out with intensive care at home, everybody was saying, oh, nobody will pay for this. This is just crazy. You can't take patients home from ICU. And I said at the time, I'm not worried about who pays for this. What I do know is that there's a need for it. That's all I knew. I knew there was a need for it. I wasn't worried about who was going to pay for it. And lo and behold, once we've, started advocating for our clients, the funding was following. And it wasn't, our clients are not privately paying because there's a business model in there. There's economics in there. If we cut the cost of an intensive care bed by half, that's a win-win situation. So everybody should have an interest in that, including funding bodies, including hospitals. It's a win-win situation. So your concern should not be around funding or who's paying for it. Your concern should be around setting it up properly so that you can have this service at home predictably, with little disruptions, with no hospital admissions. That is the most important aspect of this. So now looking at the practical steps, and I know some of you are watching here, they're in the US, they're in the UK, and I get it that our intensive care at home service is not available yet in those areas, and you think you have no other choice. And unfortunately, some of the areas, especially in remote areas in the US, it is very difficult. Sometimes we have inquiries from someone in remote New Mexico or remote Texas or all sorts of places far away from metropolitan areas, and it's very difficult to set it up there. Don't get me wrong, and the lack of specialist services is the biggest challenge in this. It's not funding, it's the lack of specialist services. But I can't stress enough that if it's not set up properly, you're running the risk of bouncing back into ICU, or you're running the risk of even worse, potentially clients dying, and you don't want that. You definitely don't want that. It's terrible when it happens. It's terrible for the families. It's terrible for us, but I can only imagine what the families are still going through after the incidents happened. So what's the solution? I just, obviously, if you're here in Australia, if you're watching this and you're in Australia, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, we are there already. We are also branching out now into Adelaide and into Perth. So Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, you should absolutely contact us. We can help you with 24-hour intensive home care nursing. Let's just quickly focus on our audience in the US. On the East Coast specifically, there is a service in New York that I can set you up with. There is also a service in, I think it's South Carolina or in North Carolina. I do have the details. If you're in North Carolina or South Carolina, you should contact me and I can give you some contacts there. They're not as specialized as we are, but I know they have helped some clients to go home from ICU, and I am in contact with those clients, and they are saying good things about the services they're getting. So in some areas, there is help. And unfortunately, we're not in the US yet. We absolutely want to help our friends in the US, but we're just not there yet. And you are in North Carolina, Modema. Yes, if you need intensive care at home, you should contact me. You can find the contact details on our website at intensivecarehotline.com or intensivecareathome.com. Just go on the My Contact section and either send me an email there or call me on one of the numbers, and then I can set you up with the service there. Can't remember now off the top of my head whether it was North or South Carolina, but somewhere in that area. So what should you do though if you are desperate of leaving intensive care, and again, if you're a Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, just contact us. We can help you with funding. We can help you with a nursing team. You are definitely in the right locations if you are in those areas. For our friends in the US, what should you be doing if you are stuck in the middle of nowhere, for lack of a better term, far away from a metropolitan area, and your loved one is in ICU or is in LTAC? It's going to be very challenging, right? You will need a service provider that is prepared to hire ICU nurses, which is a challenge in and of itself, because not every organization can attract, retain, train and manage intensive care nurses in the community. That's a challenge in and of itself, and that's exactly what we're specialized on here. What we can do for our friends in the US or in the UK as well is, if you are finding a service provider that is prepared to hire intensive care nurses and work with you getting your loved one home, we can definitely help them with training, right? We've got training manuals. We can help people in online sessions to train how to take someone home from intensive care. That is the bare minimum we can do for our friends in the US and in the UK, you know, and we're happy to work with other service providers that are prepared to look into this growing and much needed area, right? Another thing that I want to quickly say is the timing of going home, right? And the timing of going home is also critical. You know, sometimes we have families coming to us, they have a loved one in intensive care for 3 or for 4 days, and they say, oh, my mum, my dad, my sister, my brother, whoever, would be so much better off at going home. And I will say this as well, if someone has been in ICU for less than 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you shouldn't probably even considering intensive care at home, because your goal should be to get your loved one out of ICU, off a ventilator, and get them on a hospital floor or on a hospital ward, and you know, don't even think about intensive care at home, right? Intensive care at home should not be a goal for you. It can be a goal for you if your loved one has been in ICU for 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, or longer, and has a tracheostomy and is ventilated, or is ICU dependent. Absolutely, that's when you should be starting to think about intensive care at home. And I know we've got Leonie here, and thanks, Leonie, for your kind words. You know, for your sister, intensive care at home would have absolutely been an option, you know, in her journey. But obviously, you are in the UK, and it would have been very difficult for us to set this up for you. And I believe where you are, there are no services, or at least nobody that could have set it up quickly. But in your situation, after your sister had been in ICU for about, can't remember now, for about 4 months or something like that, absolutely, intensive care at home would have definitely been an option for your sister Leonie. But generally speaking, you know, out of 10 inquiries that we are getting, there's probably only 2 where I would say, you know, yep, this is someone that can actually benefit from intensive care at home, you know. As it should not be a goal. Intensive care at home is more of a necessity. If a patient in ICU is long-term, is ventilated, has a tracheostomy, can't come off the ventilator, has had multiple failed weaning attempts, or, you know, in your sister's case, Leonie, like with BiPAP dependency, you know, where I think at least she would need a nurse there when she's on BiPAP, right? She may not need a nurse there when she's off the BiPAP, but, you know, that's hopefully something we can find out this week when we look into your sister's situation further. You know, it's, you know, depends what happens when people are off BiPAP. Do they go on high flow oxygen? Do they go on room air? Do they not need? So it depends on a number of reasons. So every case is unique, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. What I will say is this, though: for someone with a tracheostomy or with a trach and a ventilator, you will need 24-hour intensive care nurses at home. There is no way around this, unfortunately. And the logistics around it are not straightforward. I will tell you that as well. As much as I would like to tell you it's all quick and easy, unfortunately it's not. It needs to be set up properly. Again, right equipment, right timing, right team, right? If you have 24 hours ICU nurses at home, even if we can send you staff fairly quickly, you know, you will come back to us and you will say, oh, I really like this nurse, I really like this nurse, but I don't like this nurse. Can we fine tune their approach, or do we need to look for replacement? You know, it's not a straightforward approach. You will need to have the right people in your home that you know, like, and trust, and that are the right fit for your team, the right fit for your loved one, the right fit for your home. it's a super sensitive environment. The other thing that I will say is this: you will read of examples on the internet or on some outlets. You will read of examples where some families have taken home their loved ones independently and they manage. Okay, you will see those cases every now and then, but they are very rare cases, and the risk, I believe, the risk the families are taking, they're not even aware of. Right? It only takes one fraction of an emergency and things can go wrong very quickly. Tracheostomy tubes might block, ventilators might stop, um, and these are the things you need to really consider. Also, fatigue. You know, fatigue is a big one. Families burn out if they do too much of the work themselves, right? I've seen that over and over again where families burn out. And, you know, you should be, when your loved one is at home, you should be a spouse, you should be a mother, you should be a father, you should be a brother, a sister, a parent, a child. You should play that role, not the role of a caregiver. Because the role of a caregiver really should be left up to the professionals. And I know you're not shy of anyone watching this. I know you're not shy of helping out, of course, but I believe you are much better suited in having the role of the family, relationship that you have, and not that of a caregiver, so that you don't burn out. Very important. Very, very important. So, also equipment. When you go home, you want to have all equipment in place. You want to have a special care bed if that's what you need. You want to have a hoist machine or a ceiling hoist or a lifting machine, whatever you want to call it. So you want all of that in place before you're going home. You need the right ventilator. You need a backup ventilator. You need ventilator circuits. You need to know how often you change those circuits. You need backup tracheostomy equipment. You need emergency equipment for in case a tracheostomy blocks. You need suction equipment. And again, you need not only one suction machine, you need a backup suction machine. You will need a nebulizer. You will need some sort of monitoring, right? Ideally, at least an overnight monitor, right? For some clients, you will need to monitor during the day as well. But as you can already see, it needs to be thought through properly on all levels, whether it's on a family dynamic level, whether it's on an equipment level, whether it's on a funding level. You really need to think it through very carefully and very, very properly. You also need to think about issues such as, if you engage with a service provider, whether that's us or whether it's other services that you might engage with, what's their track record? Do they have a track record in this area? Even if they haven't got a track record, how can they compensate for lack of track record? Who are other organizations they can partner with, i.e., if you take, again, the US or the UK at the moment where we don't have services as yet, if there is an agency that is prepared to look at hiring intensive care nurses, can they partner with us for training? There are ways of managing that going forward, but I will also say the closer you are, and it doesn't matter which country you're in, the closer you are to a metropolitan area with access to intensive care nurses, the higher chances are that this can happen. Okay, here is another issue that I remember now, wanted to mention in the beginning, but it just comes to me now. A lot of families say, oh, we're so desperate to go home, and can we just, set it all up and go home? Now, here is a challenge. and they're prepared to go home against medical advice. Now, here is a challenge. If you are going home against medical advice, there's a very high chance you may not get the funding, because the funding should come under a medical umbrella as well, that doctors are supporting you to go home. From our perspective as a nursing service, we can't really take somebody home against medical advice, because then we would practice outside of our scope of practice, right? And we can't do that because, we wouldn't be covered from an insurance point of view. Our nurses could lose their registration. There would be all sorts of liability issues. So again, I can't stress enough that I do understand that if you have a loved one in intensive care, you want to get out of there as quickly as possible. And again, my answer to that is one step at the time. It's got to be set up properly with the right team, with the right people, with the right support structure, because lack of support structure could be very detrimental to you and your loved one, and you don't want that. And I know patience is a virtue, why can't you hurry the F up, but in this situation, patience is a virtue, and you will see the benefits of setting it up properly down the line. You will see the rewards down the line, but not in the short term. Okay, so I think I've covered most of the points that I wanted to talk about. There are other things that will come to me in a minute, but in the meantime, please type your questions into the chat pad if you have any questions related to this topic. Please type away what you've got in relation to today's topic, whether you can go home with intensive care at home without 24-hour intensive care nursing. Now, whilst I'm waiting for your questions, also want to highlight that if you are in Australia, most of our service now is funded through the NDIS, and not all of it. Some of it is funded through other insurance companies as well. For example, if you've got private health insurance, you should definitely contact me. Even if you are in a public hospital, you should contact us. And if you don't have access to the NDIS, for example, or other funding bodies, you should contact us. We get funding, for example, through the DVA, Department of Veteran Affairs, through the TAC, the Transport and Accident Commission, also through iCare in New South Wales. So there's a number of funding bodies that we've engaged with, and we even sometimes get funding through public hospitals directly, because, as I said before, there is an economic model in this, because we're cutting the cost of an intensive care bed by half, and we're freeing up an ICU bed that is in high demand anyway, right? What I should also say for our viewers in the UK, we have worked with a client, maybe 2 years ago, can't remember now, it might be 2 years ago roughly, it was just before COVID, I think. Would have been 2018, 2019. We've worked with a client in the UK close to London. They had their father in intensive care for about 12 months. Their father was ventilated with a tracheostomy, but his brain was working, and he kept saying he wants to get out of ICU and he wants to live. Leonie, I'm coming to that because I'm talking now about this client in the UK. Just I'm hopefully illustrating that to you now. So when we worked with this client in the UK close to London, they had their loved one in ICU for about 12 months, ventilated tracheostomy. I can't remember now off the top of my head what got him in there. I think he had some sort of degenerative condition that got him on a ventilator. Complicated a few things with pneumonia, but eventually, he was mobile, but he couldn't leave intensive care because he was ventilated with a tracheostomy. The ICU was pushing for end of life, of course. They said, well, he won't have any quality of life. Where would he go? He can't go home on a ventilator. The best option for him would be to stop everything, and the family and the client was very adamant that's not going to happen, and that he wanted to live and that he wanted to go home to be with his family. So after many rounds of family meetings, and I was there mainly over the phone, and I was educating the ICU about what we're doing here in Australia, they finally started to listen, and the client then, lodged an appeal to the NHS, and eventually the NHS came forward and funded home care. And I'm still in contact with this client. Their father has now been at home for the last 2 years with ICU nurses at home, funded by the NHS. Well, that's how it should be, because again, the NHS is saving money. The NHS is saving money by getting this patient home into a home care setting with ICU nurses. That costs the NHS half of what it would cost them in ICU. And patients and families have choice. Leonie, I can set you up with this client. That client knows much more about how they dealt with the NHS and how they got to the funding. But as I said, and I will say that to everyone listening to this, the funding should be the least of your concerns. The logistics and the operations should be your concerns, not the funding. The funding is there. In the US, if you're there, private health funds, well, why would they not fund intensive care at home if they're paying for a $5,000, $6,000 a day intensive care bed? There's a business model in there that everybody would be interested in, right? And we've all seen the doctors, not wanting to continue treatment. Yes, the doctors might have a different opinion, but that should not concern you. You should just advocate for what you know is right for your loved one and what you know is right for your family, So the funding side of things should not concern you. So I hope, Leonie, that answers your questions. Again, it's not a straightforward process, Leonie, definitely not, but it can be done, and it can absolutely be done. Yes, your sister, Leonie, was in ICU for 6 months, but your sister now, thankfully, at least has the tracheostomy removed, and that's one less layer of complexity. It's complex enough with your sister, but it's at least she has the tracheostomy removed, which is really good. Helene, you've got a question, and hi Helene, nice to see you again. Just give me a second. I'll just got to bring up your question again. When a patient is on BiPAP machine due to carbon dioxide, what is the protocol for how to be on it? Due to carbon dioxide, late mum with iatrogenic causation, chronic areas, uninformed, was on it 27 hours without a break. Yeah, great question, Helene. So when someone goes on BiPAP for high carbon dioxide, the first thing you do is you put someone on BiPAP, and often you see the carbon dioxide come down pretty quickly, assuming they start with the right settings. You probably have to play around with the settings a little bit. You have to play around with IPAP and EPAP, which is the higher PEEP and the lower PEEP. You have to play around a little bit with pressure support settings, and then you have to check your blood gases to see whether carbon dioxide is coming down. You also have to assess, with high carbon dioxide, patients often get drowsy because the carbon dioxide makes the brain foggy, okay? So, and then you should also be able to see that once carbon dioxide comes down, you should be able to see if a patient clears up mentally, okay? Now, with your mum's situation, Helene, with chronic ARDS, if she was on it for 72 hours without a break, I would think it would have led to intubation eventually. Is that what's happened, Helene? Did your mum started on BiPAP, high carbon dioxide, they couldn't get carbon dioxide down, and then she ended up intubated? Is that what's happened? And if she did end up intubated, it would have been driven by blood gases, by deteriorating blood gases, and it would have been driven by conscious state of your mum, right? She probably would have become less and less conscious, which means she was no longer in a position to maintain a stable airway. There are risks associated with 72 hours of BiPAP, for example, aspiration pneumonia, right? Once someone is intubated, at least that's protecting from an aspiration pneumonia most of the time. When someone is on BiPAP and unconscious, there's a high risk of aspiration pneumonia, right? If your mum got septic, like you've just said, that might also have contributed to her getting intubated. But I think Helene, if she didn't wake up, if blood gases didn't improve on the BiPAP for 72 hours, she would have been a strong candidate for intubation. So the protocol really is that if blood gases and mental state doesn't improve with BiPAP, it inevitably leads to intubation eventually. Right? I hope that answers your question, Helene. And if she became septic as part of this, most likely she would have needed intubation anyway. Many patients that come into ICU that go into sepsis or even septic shock end up intubated on multiple forms of life support. Okay, so are there any other questions? Are there any other questions? So while I'm waiting for some other questions, just quickly want to go back to the funding side of things. Again, that should be the least of your concerns. Focus on the logistics around how to go home. Focus on that rather than worrying about the finances. Always keep in mind that someone is funding that ICU bed, and that ICU bed is $5,000 to $6,000 US dollars a day, $5,000 to $6,000 Australian dollars a day. In the UK, you're probably talking about £3,500 a day. Always keep that figure in mind, that there is a business model in there that someone can cut costs by going home, and any business will be interested in that, and that's including health insurance or similar organizations that fund healthcare. Helen, you're saying there was an iatrogenic cut esophagus injury that were covered up. Right. Look, I can't comment on, what was covered up or not. I would need to look at all the medical records, or we would need to look at all the medical records to say whether there was a cover up or not. I can't comment on that, Helene. Would need to look at medical records. Look, I am conscious of the time. We're coming to close to the 40-minute mark. I do need to wrap this up in a minute. I do really appreciate everyone coming onto this live stream, and I want to thank you for your support. Thank you for your kind words, and there will be another live stream again next week around the same time, 7 p.m. US Eastern Standard Time, 4 p.m. Pacific Time next Saturday, 11 a.m. Sydney, Melbourne time on a Sunday, and we'll go from there. If you like this content, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my YouTube channel for updates for families in intensive care, click the notification bell for new videos, and leave your comments below. If you have a loved one in intensive care, go to intensivecarehotline.com. Give us a call on one of the numbers on the top of the website, or if you need intensive care at home, give us a call. Go to intensivecareathome.com and give us a call on the numbers on the top of the website, or simply send us an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com. Have a wonderful night and a wonderful day wherever you are. I'll see you next week. Take care for now. Thank you.